Tonight, race against time. The frantic search for anyone who might have survived under a massive mudslide. Danielle Nottingham has the first desperate calls for help.
Everything's gone. The houses are gone. There's people yelling for help.
Time is also running out for the Flight 370 flight recorders. Holly Williams on the search. Chip Reed on the sophisticated equipment they're using. Jan Crawford reports Obamacare is back before the Supreme Court. Can a health plan be forced to cover women's contraceptives? And Jim Axelrod with another embarrassing breach of security at the tallest terror target in America.
This is the CBS Evening News with Scott Pelley.
Good evening. Rescue workers are risking their lives tonight in Oso, Washington, searching ground that has been compared to quicksand for victims of the mudslide. 3 days after it buried this village north of Seattle, 14 people are known dead, but dozens more are still unaccounted for. Among them, 30-year-old Billy Spillers, father of 4, a career counselor for the Navy. 3 of his children are missing as well. The 4th child, 4-year-old Jacob, was rescued from the debris. CBS News correspondent Danielle Nottingham is on the scene for us tonight. Danielle?
Scott, more than 60 members of the Washington National Guard joined the search today. We're told teams are pinging for cell phone signals in the hopes of finding anyone under the debris and mud. Search teams moved in heavy equipment, but they also had to resort to using their hands in some places to dig through the thick mud. Cameras are being inserted into air pockets in the hope of finding survivors. But the only thing search dogs seem to find are bodies. No signs of life have been detected in 3 days. Emergency Management Director John Pennington.
I believe in miracles, and I believe people can survive these events. They've done it before, they can do it again.
This view of the mudslide was recorded shortly after it buried Oso. The village is on a bend of the river at the base of a 600-foot hill. Seismic monitors indicated the landslide lasted more than 2 minutes and covered a square mile.
Emergency.
There's like a mudslide and everything's gone. The houses are gone.
It's been hard to pin down the number of missing. The current list includes names and descriptions of people spotted in the area just before the landslide. So officials expect there's mistakes and duplications among the 176 on the list. Ray Smith's daughter Summer was last seen driving through Oso.
Do you think that there's hope to find some people still alive in all of this?
No. The rescue efforts were too little and they were too late. There are not going to be any more survivors.
The threat of another mudslide and more rain has prolonged the search and the agony.
My son and his 2 young sons, my 16-year-old daughter, went in Saturday and they dug until dark, until they were threatened to be arrested. They dug with their bare hands.
Scott, this area has had 15 inches of rain this month, but we also learned today that seismologists detected a 1.1 magnitude earthquake on March 10th close to the site of the landslide. Authorities are trying to determine what role that might have played in this disaster.
And still raining there this evening. Danielle, thanks very much. Now, to the search for the wreckage of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. Today, gale force winds grounded the planes that were looking for debris. If there is a middle of nowhere, it is the search zone in the southern Indian Ocean west of Australia. Holly Williams is in Perth, where it's Wednesday morning. Holly?
Scott, the search is due to resume here in Western Australia this hour with 12 planes and 2 ships all headed to an area 1,500 miles off the coast that is known for its very difficult weather conditions.
It's one of the most hostile and remote areas in the world.
Professor Charitha Pattiaratchi is an oceanographer who spent more than 2 decades studying the treacherous waters of the southern Indian Ocean.
It's the region that we call the Roaring Forties. It's very strong winds and big waves. The waves are 15 feet on average, or more than 30 feet when there is a storm.
He's used satellite data to build a computer model that predicts where debris from the Boeing 777 may end up. With as little as 2 weeks battery life left in the plane's black boxes, he told us it's unlikely they'll ever be found.
They'll have to be extremely lucky. It would take a lot of time before they can find it.
And he's not surprised that the search planes have so far sighted very little on the ocean's surface.
Most of the wreckage would be at the seabed.
Most of the wreckage will have sunk. The waters where the plane went down range up to 20,000 feet, 7,000 feet deeper than where the Titanic was found.
So this is go to 200 meters.
Which means the search and recovery operation will probably rely on high-tech tools, like this US Navy robotic submarine that uses sonar to find objects at extreme depths. One of them will arrive in Australia on Wednesday. Another piece of equipment called a pinger locator has also been sent from the US to try to find the plane's black boxes. But Scott, it can't be operational in the search area until April 5th, and that's just 3 days before the black box's batteries could run out.
And 18 days now since the plane disappeared. Holly, thanks very much. Chip Reed has been looking into that pinger locator that Holly just mentioned and other high-tech gear that the U.S. is sending to the search.
Kurt Newport is a search and recovery specialist for Phoenix International, which is sending sophisticated equipment to the Indian Ocean to try to find Flight 370.
What is this exactly?
This is a small towed vehicle, and it is designed specifically to detect the acoustic beacons that are attached to the flight data recorders from commercial airliners.
In other words, to detect the pinger, as we call it.
The pinger that's attached to the black box.
How exactly do you find that on the bottom of the ocean?
Well, the way it works is that when this is immersed in water, fresh water or salt water, it puts out a chirp of sound at a very specific frequency at 1 pulse per second.
But a pinger only emits a signal for 30 to 40 days, so Phoenix is sending an autonomous underwater vehicle, or AUV, like this one, that searches for debris underwater. Paul Nelson is a project manager at Phoenix.
So after the pinger locator, this is the next step?
This is the next step. This is called the Artemis AUV.
This thing will do what when it goes down to the bottom of the ocean?
This has side scan sensors on it and cameras. So the tail cone here drives it. You put it in the water, you do your checks, and then it spirals down to the bottom. And then based on your pre-programming, it'll run a search pattern. Like, think like mowing the lawn, up and back, and it collects data for 20 hours.
But if there's no clear indication of exactly where a plane went down, Scott, the search can become agonizingly slow. 5 years ago, when an Air France passenger jet crashed in the Atlantic, it took 3 of those AUVs 2 years to find it.
A troubling thought for the families involved, Chip. Thanks very much. In Beijing, those families marched to the Malaysian embassy today to protest what they consider to be the mishandling of the disaster. They say Malaysian authorities have lied. 2/3 of the 227 passengers were Chinese, 3 were American. The 12-member crew was Malaysian. In Washington today, the president's health care law was back before the Supreme Court. The issue for the justices is whether a health insurance plan can be forced to cover contraceptives over the religious objections of an employer, in this case, a corporation. Chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford was in the court.
The arguments were unusually intense and divisive. The court's 3 female justices, all liberal, defended the law and dismissed arguments by business owners that the contraceptive coverage requirement violates religious freedom. Most forceful was Justice Elena Kagan, a former top lawyer in the Obama administration who clashed repeatedly with attorney Paul Clement. Kagan said if business owners could object to birth control coverage based on religious grounds, what about the next case? Suppose an employer refuses to fund vaccinations for her employees or blood transfusions. One religious group could opt out of this and another religious group could opt out of that, and everything would be piecemeal. Clement, a top lawyer in the George W. Bush administration, pushed back, saying those cases were different. His clients provide coverage for most birth control methods and argue the government should make an exception in the law so they would not have to cover pills and devices that may prevent an embryo from implanting in the womb. The court's conservatives seem to agree. Chief Justice John Roberts provided the key vote to uphold the health care law 2 years ago. Today, he suggested the law's contraception requirement forced religious business owners to violate their conscience. Said Roberts they have to pay for methods of contraception that they believe provide abortions.
But the wild card is Justice Anthony Kennedy. He's a conservative, but sometimes he votes with the liberals. So, Scott, today in court, he seemed sympathetic to the business owners, but he also expressed some concerns about whether a religious objection could trump a woman's access to health care.
Jan, thank you very much. Today, President Obama vowed to defend NATO countries should any of them be threatened by Russia. But he all but ruled out military action to force the Russians out of Crimea, which they seized from Ukraine last week. During a news conference in the Netherlands, Mr. Obama belittled Russian President Vladimir Putin, calling Russia a regional power.
Russia's actions are a problem. They don't pose the #1 national security threat to the United States. I continue to be much more concerned when it comes to our security with the prospect of a nuclear weapon going off in Manhattan.
Today, Mr. Obama also proposed changes to a controversial surveillance program in which the National Security Agency scoops up the phone records of Americans. Here's Bob Orr on the new plan.
Under the administration's proposal, telephone companies like Verizon and AT&T would collect the phone records of millions of Americans and retain the data for 18 months. The government could only access specific records with court orders in terrorism investigations. President Obama said today the new approach would balance privacy and security concerns.
I'm confident that it allows us to do what is necessary in order to deal with the dangers of a terrorist attack, but does so in a way that addresses some of the concerns that people had raised.
The proposed overhaul of the key surveillance program comes 10 months after former NSA contractor Edward Snowden first revealed its existence. Intelligence officials have stressed the NSA only collects lists of numbers and lengths of calls and does not monitor content. Still, privacy advocates warn the program could be abused, so they've called for an end to bulk collection of Americans' phone calls. But House Intelligence Committee Democrat Dutch Ruppersberger says phone records must remain available in some form to preserve a key tool for tracking terrorists.
It's like finding a needle in a haystack, the terrorist being the needle. And if you're going to find a needle in a haystack, you need the haystack.
Ruppersberger is backing a bipartisan bill that largely mirrors the president's proposal. While details remain to be worked out, Scott, it's pretty obvious the NSA's reach is likely to be reined in.
Bob Orr in our Washington newsroom. Bob, thanks very much. A terrible fire has consumed an entire apartment complex and saving the salmon a truckload at a time when the CBS Evening News continues. Today was the deadline for GM and the government's auto safety agency to tell Congress what they knew about a deadly defect in some GM cars. At least 12 people have died and 31 have been injured in accidents linked to faulty ignition switches. Jeff Glore has been investigating this.
After the Chevrolet Cobalt was introduced 10 years ago, there were problems from the start, including a defective ignition switch that could suddenly turn the engine off, disabling power steering, power brakes, and the airbags. Both GM and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration have said, despite having received numerous reports of those problems, it was difficult to see a growing trend. But we analyzed data from the government's early warning reporting system, which car manufacturers use to report accidents when someone is injured or killed. It shows in model years 2005 and 2006, the first model years for the car, GM reported more claims of injury and death with airbags as a contributing factor than any other car in its class. In 2006, Cobalt had more than 50 times as many airbag claims as Honda Civics, and 5 times the claims of the Toyota Corolla and Ford Focus. In another accident reporting database we analyzed, 05 and 06 Cobalts had the highest fatality rate per 1,000 vehicles sold in its class, and the highest rate of fatal accidents when airbags did not deploy. Today, Senator Richard Blumenthal co-sponsored legislation that would put more accident data in the hands of the public sooner.
When you see those numbers, what's your reaction?
These graphs are pictures of death and destruction on a scale that is staggering, when full disclosure could have stopped them.
Many families of people who died in cobalts had no idea there was a problem.
Amber would have been
26 this year.
Laura Christian's daughter, Amber Rose, died in a cobalt in 2005.
When you lose your daughter, whether you're the first one or whether you're the last one, she's still gone. And it's still their fault for not fixing the problem.
Would you let your kids drive these cars?
I wouldn't allow my children behind the wheel of one of these cars. GM should take these cars off the road.
GM says they are still doing an internal investigation, but they told us today they believe, quote, the vehicles are safe to drive with just the key and ring only and nothing else. We also just received a statement from NHTSA. They say they repeatedly reviewed relevant data available at the time, but that data was not sufficient to warrant a formal investigation. Scott, NHTSA says based on new information they've gotten from GM, they're taking another look.
To be clear, nothing but the key on the key ring. Jeff, thanks very much. The skies over Houston were filled with thick black smoke today as an apartment complex under construction went up in flames. The flames spread quickly in high winds. 200 firefighters focused on protecting neighboring buildings. No injuries were reported, and there's no word on the cause. 3 men have been arrested after they jumped off America's tallest building. That story is next. The skyscraper known as One World Trade Center is considered a prime target for terrorists. Yet we learned today of a security breach there. A group of men got inside the building still under construction and parachuted off the roof. Here's Jim Axelrod.
The video recorded by the skydivers is breathtaking, but New York City's Mayor Bill de Blasio doesn't find anything amusing about the stunt last September at the World Trade Center.
It's obviously not an acceptable state of affairs, but we think it's one that together we can resolve.
It was 3 o'clock in the morning. The 3 men say they had no trouble gaining access to the construction site of the 1,776-foot tall tower. Marko Markovic was one of the jumpers.
We found a little hole in a fence between a wall and a fence, and we just pushed it open, walked right in. We got to the top. We didn't see one person the entire way up from the ground.
Police dispute that, saying one of the men was an iron worker with access to the site. The NYPD used surveillance cameras to identify every license plate in the immediate area after a witness reported the jump. That led them to one of the suspects. They turned themselves in yesterday. Last week, a 16-year-old slipped through a fence and climbed to the top of the tower.
I know that both City Hall and One Police Plaza are concerned about this situation, and we are going to deepen our coordination with the Port Authority Police to address it.
Hundreds of officers are assigned to the area in and around Ground Zero, a site still considered a top terror target. The Port Authority, the agency responsible for securing the site, declined our request for an interview, providing a statement instead that police will go to any length to bring those who defile the World Trade Center site to justice.
And a source at the NYPD tells me the tower won't loom large as a terror threat until there are people in it. Quote, it's not a serious security concern right now. It's a construction site. Scott, those jumpers have a court date in July.
Jim Axelrod, downtown. Jim, thanks. Now a little more on that baby gorilla that was delivered by C-section a couple of weeks ago at the San Diego Zoo. She came down with pneumonia, but today the zoo tells us she's all better. And she met her mom for the first time yesterday. Since then, they have been inseparable. And we will be right back. Finally tonight, California's been dry for going on 3 years, and that is interfering with one of nature's wonders, the annual migration of salmon from streams and rivers to the Pacific. But it turns out the fish won't have to make the journey alone. Here's John Blackstone.
At the Coleman Fish Hatchery on the upper Sacramento River, the first of 12 million baby salmon were loaded into trucks this morning. California's long drought has left the river so low that for the first time in 2 decades, the hatchery can't release the fish raised right at the hatchery. They'll be carried more than 200 miles downriver, where they'll have an easier time reaching the ocean. John McManus leads the Golden Gate Salmon Association, which urged the federal government to truck the fish.
survival will be much, much higher than if those fish were released into the drought-stricken river where the hatchery is. In fact, some estimates suggest that the survival will be up to 18 times higher than if the fish were released at the hatchery.
Okay, let her rip. At the end of their journey by truck, the young salmon are released into pens where they'll spend a few hours getting accustomed to the river. Then they will swim onto the ocean just over 60 miles away. How do you know whether or not this is a success?
These fish actually have coated wire tags implanted in them. When they come back as adults, those tags will be recovered, and we will know what the survival is as a result of recovering these tags.
Over the next 3 weeks, dozens of truckloads will make the same journey. It's seen as essential to the $1.4 billion fishing industry in California. Captain John Atkinson runs a charter fishing boat out of San Francisco Bay.
Salmon is our bread and butter. That's our main money maker.
If you put a salmon in a truck, is he going to know where his home is?
They know. They know. They're a lot smarter than we are.
Sometimes nature just needs a lift. John Blackstone, CBS News, Rio Vista, California.
And that's the CBS Evening News for tonight. For all of us at CBS News all around the world, good night.